This is the best-selling phone of all time, but many believe that it doesn't quite hold a candle to this, what some people consider the GOAT. So, is the HTC One M8 the best phone ever made? And how does the iPhone 6 come into all of this? Let's talk about that. Hey guys, I'm Ryan Thomas, and we need to go back a little bit. See, for some time, Android phones had a stigma for being poorly made and lagging behind the iPhone in both software and hardware. They didn't get the same app priority, they lacked great cameras, and so on, and many iPhone owners at the time were very smug about this. HTC bucked this trend by releasing the much-loved One M8 with a gorgeous metal build, stereo front-firing speakers, and high-end 1080p display. It released to critical acclaim, was adored by Android and tech enthusiasts, and has since become a bit of a cult hero actually, moulding the path for Android phones to be built better by setting a new watermark. It was a success, but you'd think it would leave huge boots to fill for its successor. We weren't ready for what would come next though. Debuting in 2014, HTC's One M8 took things further with a curvier, friendlier build, bigger display, and additional camera for depth mapping. It was bigger, faster, lasted even longer on a charge, and was loved by many enthusiasts because it carried on that trend of being a better built Android smartphone with some pretty interesting features. Remember, this was a time when companies weren't afraid to push the boat out and try something new. You only have to look at the M8, the Droid Turbo, the Nexus 6, the LG G3. This might be the biggest year for smartphone innovation. Because whilst the noise surrounding the One M8 was loud and engaging, the iPhone was having a little revolution of its own. See, up until 2014, I'd met plenty of iPhone users who had the 4S and the 5 who would tell me that my Nexus 4's 4.7-inch display was just too unwieldy and far larger than anyone could ever need. They'd almost laugh at how stupidly large the 4.7-inch display was, and then Apple launched this. And guess what the size of its display was? For the first time ever, Apple released a phone with a screen over 4 inches in size, with the 4.7-inch 6 and the 5.5-inch 6 Plus. Apple was ready to take on the phablet market. And though this generation of iPhone was definitely not without its controversies, it was an undoubted success. iPhone fans and prospective 6 and 6 Plus buys clearly didn't feel that a 4.7-inch screen was too big, because over the phone's lifespan, the iPhone 6 series sold an unprecedented 220+ million units, and became by far the best-selling smartphone ever made. It was absolutely everywhere, in the headlines, on social media, and in the world as a whole. Meanwhile, HTC's arguably objectively better One M8, the phone that Android fans fell head over heels for, wasn't selling like hotcakes, and the Taiwanese firm was struggling to keep its head above water. Unfortunately, after years of mixed releases, disappointments, and rushed attempts to regain relevance in an ever-dominated smartphone space, the company would pull out of the market altogether, leaving its mark on the smartphone space and then fading out really. But the One M8, in retrospect, should have been more popular. Sure, the $650 price point was pretty big back in the day, but its screen was considerably better than the iPhone 6's with a 5-inch LCD panel. Its front-firing speakers were both louder and clearer than its competitors too. And remember when all phones came with a headphone port? Good times, honestly. The M8 was about as quick as the iPhone at the time, and its build felt far sturdier than the clearly quite snappable Apple. There was one particular area where the HTC model really struggled compared to the iPhone, and that was its camera. See, the M8 persisted with the same sensor and lens from its predecessor. This was a 4-megapixel affair that HTC dubbed Ultra Pixel. As a concept, it actually makes a fair amount of sense. These older smartphone camera sensors were absolutely tiny, and so to combat the poor low-light performance and terrible dynamic range, the idea was that you'd make the individual photo sites or pixels on the sensor larger to capture more information at the cost of a little bit of sharpness and detail, because it's only 4 megapixels. By comparison, the iPhone 6 had the same size sensor but at 8 megapixels, so the photo sites were half the size and therefore theoretically couldn't capture the same amount of dynamic range and color information. In reality, however, this extra dynamic range supposedly afforded by the larger photo sites never really materialized, and so images just came out softer than the higher resolution contemporaries, with seemingly no upside. Not only was the M8's camera clearly a swing and a miss from this standpoint, but if you ever wanted to crop in or zoom, images would just quickly become mushy, and the equivalent Samsung, LG and Apple devices had a lot more leeway thanks to the higher resolution. This wasn't the only camera on the back of the M8 though. There's a 4 megapixel depth sensor above it whose job was really to add another angle for the phone to compute subject separation in portrait mode, and funnily enough, many phones after this point, and even to this very day, have depth sensors on the back to supposedly help in getting portrait mode shots. But back in 2014, this was pretty novel. And the One M8's entire camera setup was a real miss, though an admirable attempt to try something new. A lot of people forget that the regular One M8 wasn't the only version that HTC came out with. You could, for some reason, buy a SKU that came loaded with Windows Phone, making for a device that, looking back on today, does seem kind of wild. This OS was still pretty relevant at the time, and it hadn't yet met its demise. But the real MVP was the Google Play Edition that cost a little more, but came with a much cleaner, less dense, toned down and decluttered version of Android. It was kind of like a super premium Nexus phone, with those wonderful speakers and that gorgeous build. This is the one that actually caught my attention at the very least. In retrospect, the HTC One has held up pretty decently from a hardware perspective. It's not a big phone by any stretch, coming in around the same size as the standard Galaxy S24 today. It's actually rather impressive just how much screen companies are able to cram into the same size shell these days. And actually I found that a lot of the hybrid earpiece and bottom firing speaker setups on phones in 2024 get louder and fuller than the stereo front firing set on this, which is quite interesting. And this phone being stuck on Android 5 or 6, depending on which of the aforementioned SKUs you have, is a real shame too, and a stark reminder that as advanced as smartphones are these days, they are designed to be disposable. There have been so many great phones over the years, with some true GOAT contenders. There's the Galaxy Note 9 that I felt was the best balanced in hardware and software with that S Pen. There was HTC's own original Pixel that changed the game with its crazy software features and computational photography. And I have a particular soft spot for the OnePlus 3 that epitomised the flagship killer energy in stunning execution. And oh, how the Nexus 6P could have been a GOAT contender if it weren't for the horrific boot looping and SoC issues. I also think LG's G3 is probably up there, the Galaxy S4 and the Huawei P30 Pro. But I believe the HTC One M8 changed the game and fought the stigma that Android phones had of being really bad. It captured the hearts of many and sacrificed the HTC mobile brand so that we'd get premium phones from Huawei, LG, Samsung, OnePlus, Sony, and so on. It might not be my GOAT, but my goodness does it make a case for itself. What do you reckon, guys? What do you think is the GOAT for you? Is it the One M8? And would you like to see HTC come back with an actual premium smartphone? I know it recently announced that mid-range thing, but I'm not sure that's exactly the HTC that we love and remember. While you're down there in the comments, be sure to hit like if you enjoyed today's video and subscribe to never miss another upload. I've been Ryan Thomas, and I'll catch you later. Cheers.